Miss Marple and the Postman Who Never Reach Christmas. Welcome to Cafe Tales. I'm Ailey. Are you counting the days to the winter holidays, New Year and Christmas? Or do you prefer the easy warmth of summertime? Tell us below. And don't forget to subscribe so our cozy community can keep growing. Now let's begin tonight's mystery. Chapter 1. The Missing Postman. Snow had been falling since tea time, thick and soft as eiderdown, and Miss Jane Marple watched it settle on the garden path from her chair by the sitting-room fire. The flames danced pleasantly in the grate, casting warm shadows across her knitting needles as they moved with practiced rhythm. She was working on a muffler for the church bazaar, though Christmas Eve seemed rather late to be thinking of such things. Still, one never knew when a bit of warm wool might be wanted. The clock on the mantelpiece showed 8:30 when she heard the gate creak. Footsteps crunched hastily through the fresh snow, and moments later came an urgent knock at the door. Miss Marple set down her knitting with care. Visitors at this hour on Christmas Eve, no less, suggested something rather out of the ordinary. Her maid Lucy appeared at the sitting-room door, looking flustered. "It's the vicar, Miss Marple. Says it's most urgent. Show him in, Lucy. And perhaps some tea. Though I suspect the good Reverend may not stay long enough to drink it." The Reverend Leonard Clement entered, looking quite unlike his usual composed self. Snow dusted his shoulders and clung to his hat brim. His face was flushed from cold and something else, Miss Marple thought, observing him quietly. "Worry, perhaps, or fear? My dear Miss Marple, forgive the intrusion at such an hour." "Not at all, Vicar. Do sit down. You look quite chilled." He remained standing, turning his hat in his hands. "I'm afraid I've come on rather distressing business. It's Harold Sims, the postman." "Harold?" Miss Marple's needles paused mid-stitch. "Has something happened?" "He's gone missing. His wife came to the vicarage not 20 minutes ago, quite beside herself. He left the sorting office at 6 o'clock as usual, with his final delivery round before the midnight service, but he never came home." Miss Marple rose slowly, her mind already working through the implications. "Have the police been notified?" Mrs. Sims sent word to Constable Polk immediately. They found his bicycle by the lane near Old Mill Bridge, but no sign of Harold himself. "I see." Miss Marple moved to the window, gazing out at the falling snow. The flakes were larger now, dancing in the lamplight. "And what does Constable Polk make of it?" The vicar cleared his throat. "He believes Harold may have slipped on the ice. The bridge path is treacherous in this weather, as you know. They're organizing a search party, but in the dark and snow—" He trailed off, leaving the obvious unsaid. Miss Marple turned back to face him, her blue eyes thoughtful behind her spectacles. "Harold Sims has been our postman for how many years now?" 15, 20? "Nearly 23, I believe." "Quite so. And in all that time, I cannot recall a single instance of him being late with the post, let alone careless enough to slip and fall. Harold was a most methodical man, steady as a metronome, one might say." The vicar looked at her sharply. "You think something else has happened?" "I think it would be premature to draw conclusions. But I do find it curious that such a reliable man should vanish on Christmas Eve of all nights, when his route was familiar and his rounds nearly complete." A silence fell between them, broken only by the crackle of the fire. "Poor Mrs. Sims," the vicar said at last. "She's quite distraught. They have 3 children, you know. The youngest is only 7. "Yes, I know." Miss Marple's voice was gentle. "Harold always delivered their Christmas cards by hand, never through the letterbox. He liked to see their faces when they opened the door. It was a small detail, the sort of thing most people wouldn't notice or remember. But Miss Marple had made a study of small details over her many years in St. Mary Mead. Small details she'd found often revealed rather large truths about human nature. The vicar seemed to gather himself. "I should return to the vicarage. My wife is there with Mrs. Sims now, trying to comfort her. I only came to let you know, as you're so often helpful in these situations. Miss Marple inclined her head slightly. That's very kind of you to say, Vicar. I wonder, before you go, might I ask what letters Harold was delivering this evening? His final round, you said. I couldn't say precisely. Mrs. Pritchard at the sorting office would know, but she's already gone home for the holiday. Of course. Still, one imagines there would be Christmas cards mostly at this time of year. Perhaps a few last parcels from London. I suppose so. Yes. Miss Marple moved toward the door with him. Thank you for telling me, Leonard. I do hope Harold is found safe and well. Though I must confess, she paused, her hand on the doorframe. Yes? The vicar prompted. I have a rather uneasy feeling about this business. The snow is falling quite heavily now. By morning, any tracks or evidence will be quite covered over. Evidence? The vicar looked startled. Usually don't suspect foul play, Miss Marple smiled faintly. I suspect nothing yet, but I've lived long enough to know that when something appears too simple, it rarely is. A fall on the ice would be unfortunate but unremarkable. But a fall on the ice by a man who never made mistakes on the very night when he carried letters and parcels that people had been waiting for all year, that strikes me as rather remarkable indeed. After the vicar departed, Miss Marple returned to her chair but did not resume her knitting. Instead, she sat perfectly still, her fingers steepled beneath her chin, watching the snow accumulate on the windowsill. She thought of Harold Sims with his steady gait and his leather satchel, always precisely on time. She thought of Old Mill Bridge, where the lane narrowed and the path grew treacherous even in good weather. And she thought of all the letters a postman carried, all the secrets sealed in envelopes, all the words that people wrote, but never said aloud. Someone once told her that a postman knew more about a village than anyone except perhaps the doctor and the vicar. They saw who wrote to whom, who received solicitors' letters, who got parcels from London shops they couldn't afford. Miss Marple rose and moved to her writing desk. From the drawer she withdrew a small notebook where she kept observations about the village, little things that might mean nothing at all or might mean everything. She turned to a fresh page and wrote in her neat, careful hand, Harold Sims, December 24th, Old Mill Bridge. Then she underlined the date twice and sat looking at it thoughtfully until the fire burned low and the snow continued its silent work of covering the world in white. Chapter 2. The Letters in the Chioa. Snow. Miss Marple woke earlier than usual on Christmas morning, though the dawn was slow in coming. The sky hung low and gray, and snow still fell in desolate flurries, adding to what must have been 6 inches already on the ground. She dressed warmly and made her way downstairs, where Lucy was already stoking the kitchen range. Terrible business about Mr. Sims, miss, Lucy said, shaking her head. My cousin's boy was out with the search party until past midnight. Found nothing but that bicycle, they say. How very distressing for everyone concerned. Miss Marple accepted a cup of tea and stood by the kitchen window, looking out at the transformed village. St. Mary Mead lay hushed under its blanket of white, chimneys sending up thin streams of smoke into the still air. I think I shall take a walk after breakfast, Lucy. The fresh air will do me good. Lucy looked doubtful. In this weather, miss? The paths will be ever so slippery. I have my stout boots and my walking stick. I shall be quite careful, I assure you. It was just past 9 when Miss Marple set out, wrapped in her warmest coat and a sensible wool hat. The village was quiet, most families still abed or preparing for the church service later that morning. She made her way slowly along the high street, her stick tapping a steady rhythm, her keen eyes taking in every detail. Near the village green, she encountered Dr. Haydock climbing into his motor car, his medical bag in hand. Good morning, Miss Marple. Out early, I see. Good morning, Doctor. I trust you're not called out on an emergency. His face grew somber. I'm afraid so. They found Harold Sims. Miss Marple's grip tightened on her walking stick. Found him? Where? Downstream from Old Mill Bridge. A farmer spotted something caught in the reeds near Willow Bend at first light. I've just had word from Constable Polk. Is he dead? Yes. Been in the water some hours, they think. Frozen, poor devil. Dr. Haydock's breath misted in the cold air. Looks like he fell from the bridge, struck his head on the rocks below. Tragic accident, especially at Christmas. Miss Marple said nothing for a moment, her mind working rapidly. How very dreadful for his poor wife and children. Indeed. I must go and make it official, so to speak. Constable Polk is waiting. He paused, studying her face. You're looking thoughtful, Miss Marple. Not suspicious, I hope, she smiled faintly. At my age, doctor, one learns that accidents are sometimes simply accidents, but one also learns to ask questions. After Dr. Haydock departed, Miss Marple continued her walk, turning down the lane that led toward Old Mill Bridge. The snow lay thick and undisturbed here, save for the tracks made by the search party the night before, already half filled with fresh snow. As she approached the bridge, she saw a small figure crouched by the hedgerow. Young Tommy Bond, the grocer's son, was digging in a snowdrift with his mitten-covered hands. Good morning, Tommy. What have you found there? The boy looked up, his face bright with excitement. Letters, Miss Marple? Look, all scattered about in the snow. He held up several soggy envelopes, their addresses smudged but still legible. Miss Marple approached carefully and bent down to examine them. How very interesting. We should take these to Constable Polk at once. They must have fallen from poor Mr. Sims's satchel. That's what I thought, miss. There's more here, see? Tommy pointed to where several other envelopes lay half buried in the drift. Together they gathered them up, perhaps 8 or 9 in total. Most were Christmas cards, their red and green edges visible through the damp paper. Miss Marple turned each one over carefully, noting the addresses and the condition of the seals. Most were still intact, though waterlogged, but one caught her attention immediately. It was addressed to Mrs. Edith Blake, Weatherby Cottage, in a hand she didn't recognize. The envelope had been opened, its seal broken, and when she carefully extracted the card inside, she saw it was a simple Christmas greeting with holly and ivy printed on the front. No message, no signature, just the printed words, Season's greetings. How very curious. Tommy, you've done excellent work finding these. Shall we take them to the constable together? They found Constable Polk at the bridge, along with 2 men from the village who were helping to search the area. The constable looked tired and rather grim. Miss Marple, Master Tommy, what brings you out here? Tommy held up his collection proudly. Found Mr. Sims's letters in the snow, sir. Miss Marple says we should bring them to you straight away. Polk took the envelopes, rifling through them with his thick fingers. Good lad. These will need to be delivered still, I suppose, though it seems wrong somehow. Perhaps after the holiday? Miss Marple stepped closer, her voice quiet. Constable, I couldn't help but notice that one of the envelopes has been opened, the card to Mrs. Blake at Weatherby Cottage. Polk examined it with a frown. So it has. Seal must have come loose in the fall, I expect. Perhaps. Though the others seem quite secure despite having been in the snow all night. The constable looked at her sharply, then back at the envelope. What are you suggesting, Miss Marple? I'm not suggesting anything yet, merely observing. Tell me, has Mr. Sims's mail satchel been recovered? Not yet. Likely in the stream somewhere, or washed further downstream. We'll find it when the water level drops. Miss Marple nodded slowly, her eyes distant. I see, and Mrs. Blake's cottage, I recall, is just there through the trees, is it not? Not 50 yards from where we stand. That's right. What of it? Nothing, perhaps. I only thought it rather unfortunate that Harold should have an accident so very close to one of his delivery stops. One wonders whether he might have already visited Weatherby Cottage before he fell. Pock scratched his chin. Can't say. We'll ask Mrs. Blake, though I doubt she heard anything. She's elderly and a bit deaf, as I recall. Miss Marple smiled gently. Not so very elderly, Constable. Mrs. Blake is perhaps 55, and her hearing was quite acute when I last spoke with her at the church fete, but perhaps the snow muffled any sounds. She turned to go, then paused. One other small thing, the handwriting on Mrs. Blake's card strikes me as rather unusual. Quite educated, but with an odd formality to it. Almost as if someone were trying to disguise their natural hand. Now, Miss Marple, Pock began, a warning note in his voice. I know, an overactive imagination in an elderly spinster. But do take care of those letters, won't you? They may be more important than they appear. As she walked back toward the village with young Tommy chattering beside her, Miss Marple's mind was already assembling the pieces of what she'd observed, an opened envelope, a cottage tree near the site of the accident, a broken seal and smudged ink that suggested a gloved hand had handled the card, and the faint impression she had noticed on the inside of the envelope, barely visible in the pale morning light, the mark of red sealing wax pressed into the paper, as if someone had sealed it very recently and very hastily. Chapter 3. A Delivery Never Made. The church bells tolled solemnly that Christmas morning, their sound muted by the heavy snow that continued to fall. Miss Marple attended the service, sitting in her usual pew and observing the congregation with her customary discretion. Mrs. Sims was not present, naturally. Miss Marple had sent Lucy round with a basket earlier, containing a cold chicken and some practical items that might be useful in such distressing circumstances. The widow would have visitors enough offering sympathy. What she needed was someone who understood that grief required sustenance of a more mundane sort. What did interest Miss Marple was the presence of Mrs. Edith Blake, seated near the back in her customary black. The widow Blake was a handsome woman still, though her face had hardened over the years into an expression of perpetual discontent. She had come to St. Mary Mead some 5 years ago, taking the lease on Weatherby Cottage after her husband's death. She kept herself to herself, as the saying went, though she attended church regularly and contributed to the proper charities. This morning, however, Mrs. Blake's gloved hands fidgeted with her prayer book, and she left immediately after the final hymn without stopping to exchange the usual pleasantries in the churchyard. Most telling of all, she did not meet Miss Marple's eyes. It was after lunch when Constable Pock appeared at Miss Marple's door, his face grave beneath his helmet. Begging your pardon, Miss Marple, but Dr. Haydock thought you should know. He's completed Heist's examination of Mr. Sims. Miss Marple set aside her knitting. Do come in, Constable. Lucy will bring tea. When they were settled in the sitting room, Pock cleared his throat awkwardly. The doctor confirms it was an accident. Head injury, just as we thought. Poor fellow must have slipped on the ice, struck his head on the rocks, and fallen into the stream. The cold water would have done the rest, I see. And the time of death? Somewhere between 7 and 9 o'clock last evening, Dr. Haydock reckons. Difficult to be precise with the cold and the water, but that's his best estimate. Miss Marple nodded slowly. Has the mail satchel been recovered? Not yet. But there's something else, Miss Marple, and it's got me puzzled. Pock leaned forward, lowering his voice, though they were quite alone. We've had a complaint this afternoon from Colonel Faversham up at the hall. Colonel Faversham? Miss Marple's interest sharpened. I wasn't aware the colonel had returned to the village. I thought he was spending Christmas in London. Came back yesterday, apparently, and he's in quite a state, demanding to know where his letter is. His letter? He was expecting an important communication from London, from his solicitors, Brent and Weatherby. Should have arrived yesterday with the afternoon post, but Harold Sims never delivered it. The colonel telephoned the firm this morning, and they confirmed they posted it 3 days ago, marked urgent. Miss Marple's fingers stilled on her teacup. How very interesting. And this letter was definitely in Harold's possession when he left the sorting office? Mrs. Pritchard at the post office says it was. Yes, she remembers it particularly because of the firm's fancy crest on the envelope. Said Harold put it in his satchel special, being as it was for the colonel. But it was not among the letters young Tommy found this morning. No, miss. Just those Christmas cards and a few other bits. Nothing from any solicitor's office. Miss Marple sat down her cup with care. Tell me, Constable, what sort of business would bring Colonel Faversham back to St. Mary Mead on Christmas Eve? He's not a man who enjoys rural society, if I recall correctly. Polk shifted in his chair. Can't say as I know his private affairs. Miss Marple? Of course not. Though I seem to remember hearing something about a dispute over his late sister's estate. Miss Faversham died this past summer, did she not? She did, yes, quite suddenly, though she'd been ailing for some time. And there was some question about her will. I believe she had a companion who nursed her through her final illness. And there were those who suggested the companion had exercised undue influence. Polk looked uncomfortable. That's not the sort of thing I ought to discuss, miss. Quite right, though. But if the colonel was expecting a letter from his solicitors regarding an inheritance dispute, one might suppose the matter is still unresolved. She paused delicately. I wonder what such a letter might contain. Perhaps news of how the estate is to be divided, or information about other claimants. The constable remained silent, which Miss Marple took as confirmation of sorts. Constable, might I ask, who was this companion? The one who cared for Miss Faversham before her death? I don't rightly recall the name. Mrs. Blake, perhaps. Polk's head snapped up. How did you know that? I didn't know. I merely observed that Mrs. Blake appeared in the village about 5 years ago, which was when Miss Faversham's health began to decline, and I recall that Mrs. Blake once mentioned having worked as a companion and housekeeper for various families. It seemed a reasonable supposition. Well, you're right. Though the arrangement didn't end happily. From what I heard, the colonel dismissed her rather suddenly just before his sister passed. Under awkward circumstances, there was talk, yes, nothing proven, mind you, but the colonel accused her of trying to influence Miss Faversham to change her will. Said he found Mrs. Blake going through his sister's papers. Uninvited, Miss Marple absorbed this. Information quietly, and now a letter concerning that very estate has gone missing, on the night Harold Sims died practically on Mrs. Blake's doorstep. The coincidence is rather striking. Now, Miss Marple, we can't go making accusations without proof. I'm not making accusations, Constable. I'm simply noting that when two unusual events occur in such close proximity, both temporal and geographical, it suggests they may not be entirely unconnected. She rose and moved to the window, gazing out at the snow-covered village. Tell me, did anyone think to ask Mrs. Blake whether she saw or heard Harold that evening? Her cottage overlooks the lane to the bridge. I spoke to her myself this morning after church. She says she never saw him. Heard nothing unusual either, did she? Indeed, that's most unfortunate. One would think a postman's bicycle would make some noise on the lane even in the snow. Polk stood, settling his helmet back on his head. I'd best be getting back. The colonel is demanding we search for his letter, though where we're meant to look with all this snow I couldn't say. After he left, Miss Marple returned to her chair but did not resume her knitting. Instead, she sat very still, her mind working through the pieces of information like a careful hand sorting through a drawer of tangled threads. A missing letter concerning an inheritance dispute, a dismissed housekeeper who lived near where the postman died, an append Christmas card with smudged ink and fresh sealing wax, and Harold Sims himself methodical and reliable, who somehow managed to slip and fall on a route he had walked countless times before. Miss Marple thought of something her nephew Raymond had once said when he was reading one of those modern detective novels. The solution, he had declared, was always in what was absent, not what was present. What was absent here was Harold's mail satchel, which should have been found with his body or nearby. What was absent was Colonel Faversham's letter, which should have been delivered but never was. What was absent was any reasonable explanation for why Harold should have had an accident at that particular spot at that particular time. And perhaps most significant of all, what was absent was any Christmas card from Mrs. Blake's mantelpiece, when Miss Marple had glimpsed through her window that morning on her walk. Most people displayed their holiday greetings prominently, yet Mrs. Blake's sitting room had been notably bare of such decorations. Miss Marple picked up her knitting at last, her needles clicking softly in the quiet room. She would pay a call on Mrs. Blake tomorrow, a simple courtesy visit to offer condolences about the tragic accident. After all, the poor woman lived so close to where it happened. It must have been quite distressing for her. And perhaps while there she might notice whether Mrs. Blake's fire was burning unusually late for a solitary widow on a cold winter's night. Chapter 4. The Widow by the Icy. Fireboxing day dawned clear and bright, the snow glittering under a pale winter sun. Miss Marple took advantage of the improved weather to make her call on Mrs. Blake, carrying a small basket containing a jar of her own gooseberry preserves and some biscuits Lucy had baked that morning. Weatherby Cottage sat back from the lane, a neat stone building with mullioned windows and a tidy garden now buried under snow. Smoke rose from the chimney, and through the front window, Miss Marple could see the flicker of firelight. Mrs. Blake answered the door herself, her face registering surprise, and perhaps something less welcoming. "Miss Marple, this is unexpected. I do hope I'm not intruding, Mrs. Blake. I thought, living so near to where poor Mr. Sims met his end, you might appreciate some company. These tragedies affect us all, even when we're not directly involved." It was phrased as sympathy, but Miss Marple watched carefully for the reaction. Mrs. Blake's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly before she stepped back to admit her visitor. How thoughtful. "Do come in." The sitting room was warm, almost oppressively so. A substantial fire burned in the grate, and the windows were tightly shuttered despite the pleasant morning. Mrs. Blake gestured to a chair near the hearth. "Please sit down. I'll fetch the tea things." While her hostess was occupied in the kitchen, Miss Marple allowed her gaze to travel around the room with the practiced casualness of long habit. The furniture was good quality but worn, suggesting genteel poverty. A few photographs stood on the mantelpiece, mostly of a stern-looking gentleman who must have been the late Mr. Blake. But what caught Miss Marple's attention was the hearth rug. It was a handsome Turkey carpet, obviously valuable, but near one corner lay a small piece of red wax, barely visible against the pattern. She bent down as if adjusting her bootlace and, shielded by the chair arm, picked it up delicately between thumb and forefinger. The wax was still slightly pliable, not old at all. She had just secreted it in her handkerchief when Mrs. Blake returned with a tea tray. "I'm afraid I have only plain biscuits. I wasn't expecting visitors. These are lovely." "Thank you." Miss Marple accepted her cup with a pleasant smile. "What a cheerful fire you have. So important in this weather, though one does worry about the expense. I find I can barely keep one fire going these days, let alone maintain it through the night." Mrs. Blake's hand trembled slightly as she poured her own tea. "Yes, well, I feel the cold rather badly. My late husband always said I had poor circulation. Of course, though I confess I'm surprised you keep such a substantial fire. Last night must have been particularly cold. I noticed smoke from your chimney when I looked out past midnight. It was a small lie, but awful one." Mrs. Blake's cup rattled against its saucer. "I couldn't sleep. The wind was quite loud, and after I heard about poor Mr. Sims, I felt rather nervous being so close to where it happened. Naturally. How dreadful it must have been, knowing he was lying there in the cold while you were here, quite unaware. You heard nothing unusual that evening, I understand? Nothing at all. As I told the constable, I was here all evening, quite alone. Miss Marple sipped her tea thoughtfully. The room held a faint odor beneath the smell of burning wood and the lavender Mrs. Blake evidently favored. Tobacco. A particular brand, if she wasn't mistaken. The same sort Harold Sims had always smoked. A cheap shag he bought from the village shop. I wonder, Miss Marple said, her tone conversational, whether Mr. Sims had completed his deliveries before the accident. It would be a comfort to know he'd finished his work in a way. Did he perhaps stop here with your post? No, that isn't. I don't believe so. I received no post yesterday evening. How strange. Young Tommy Bond found several letters in the snow near the bridge this morning. One was addressed to you, I believe, a Christmas card. Mrs. Blake's face went very still. A Christmas card? I can't imagine from whom. I have very few correspondents. The handwriting was rather formal, quite educated, though it struck me as somewhat unusual, almost as if the writer were being deliberately careful. I'm sure I wouldn't know. Perhaps you're mistaken about the address. Miss Marple set down her cup and looked directly at her hostess. Mrs. Blake, forgive me for being rather direct, but I sense you're troubled by something beyond the tragedy of Mr. Sims's death. If there's anything you wish to tell someone in confidence, I assure you I can be most discreet. For a moment, something flickered in Mrs. Blake's eyes. Fear, perhaps, or calculation. Then her expression hardened. I have nothing to tell. Mr. Sims's death was a terrible accident, and I'm sorry for his family, but it has nothing to do with me. Of course not. Though I couldn't help noticing there was someone knocking at your door quite late on Christmas Eve. Also, I heard from Mrs. Bantry, who was returning from the vicarage. She mentioned hearing voices from your cottage after midnight. This was another calculated fabrication, but Miss Marple had learned long ago that sometimes a small untruth could reveal a larger truth. Mrs. Blake stood abruptly. Mrs. Bantry is mistaken. There was no one here. No one at all. Miss Marple rose as well, gathering her gloves with deliberate slowness. My apologies if I've upset you. I merely thought, as neighbors, we should look after one another, especially in such difficult times. She moved toward the door, then paused as if something had just occurred to her. Oh, I nearly forgot. That Christmas card the constable recovered. The seal had been broken, and there was red wax pressed into the paper. Rather unusual these days. Most people use those gummed envelopes. Do you use sealing wax yourself, Mrs. Blake? No, I mean, I may have some somewhere from years ago. Why would that matter? It probably doesn't matter at all. I have such a curious mind about these little details. My nephew says I should have been a detective. Mrs. Blake's laugh was forced. How amusing. Good day, Miss Marple. Walking back along the lane, Miss Marple reflected on what she had observed. Mrs. Blake was lying. That much was certain. The question was, what was she lying about and why? The tobacco smell suggested Harold had indeed visited the cottage. The late-burning fire suggested Mrs. Blake had been awake and active well into the night, and the scrap of red wax on the hearthrug suggested that an envelope had been sealed there recently, and hastily, most damning of all was Mrs. Blake's reaction to the mention of someone knocking after midnight. She had denied it too quickly, too vehemently, and in doing so she had confirmed what Miss Marple had only guessed. Harold Sims had come to Weatherby Cottage on Christmas Eve. He had been inside, smoking his pipe by the fire, and something had happened there that Mrs. Blake was desperate to conceal. The question now was, what Harold had been carrying that was worth killing for? A letter, perhaps, or something else entirely. Miss Marple thought of the missing mail satchel and the Colonel's complaint about his undelivered correspondence. Two mysteries, seemingly separate, but connected by the simple fact that Harold Sims had died before completing his final round. She would need to learn more about Mrs. Blake's connection to the Faversham family, and she suspected the vicar might be able to help with that particular inquiry. Chapter: The opened envelope. The vicarage was warm and smelled pleasantly of cinnamon and clove when Miss Marple arrived that afternoon. Mrs. Clement greeted her with obvious pleasure. "Miss Marple, how lovely. Do come through to the drawing room. Leonard is just finishing his correspondence, but he'll join us for tea shortly." The vicar's wife was a sensible woman with a kind face and an inexhaustible supply of patience, both qualities essential for her position. She poured tea while chattering about the Christmas service and the unfortunate business with Harold Sims, though Miss Marple noticed a certain constraint in her manner. Such a dreadful thing to happen at Christmas. Poor Mrs. Sims is bearing up as well as can be expected, though the children are quite bewildered by it all. The youngest keeps asking when his father will come home. "How heartbreaking," Miss Marple said softly. "I do hope the village will rally round to help them." "Oh, we shall certainly do what we can. There's already talk of organizing a collection." The Reverend Clement entered then, looking somewhat harried. "Miss Marple, good of you to call. I trust you're well." "Quite well, thank you, Vicar. Though I confess this business with Harold Sims has left me rather troubled." Clement settled into his chair with a sigh. "We're all troubled by it. I've just come from the police station, as it happens. Constable Palk wanted to discuss the arrangements for the inquest." "There's to be an inquest?" Miss Marple's tone was mild, but her attention sharpened. "A formality, I understand. Dr. Haydock has certified the death as accidental, but given the circumstances, the coroner felt it appropriate. It will be held next week." Miss Marple sipped her tea thoughtfully. "I wonder if I might ask you both something rather delicate. It concerns Mrs. Blake at Weatherby Cottage." The vicar and his wife exchanged glances. "What about Mrs. Blake?" Clement asked carefully. "I understand she was once employed by the Faversham family, as a companion to the late Miss Faversham, I believe." Mrs. Clement set down her cup. "That's correct, though it was some years ago, and the arrangement ended rather unfortunately." "Might I ask the circumstances?" "I don't mean to pry, but I have reason to believe it may be relevant to Harold's death." The vicar frowned. "Relevant? How could an old employment dispute have anything to do with a tragic accident?" "Perhaps it doesn't, but I've learned that Colonel Faversham was expecting an important letter from his solicitors, a letter that Harold was carrying when he died, but which has not been found. The letter concerned an inheritance dispute over Miss Faversham's estate." Clement leaned forward, his expression troubled. "Miss Marple, what exactly are you suggesting?" "I'm not suggesting anything definite yet, but I am observing certain connections that seem too significant to ignore. Mrs. Blake was dismissed by Colonel Faversham under awkward circumstances. The colonel is now involved in a dispute over his sister's estate. A letter concerning that dispute goes missing on the very night Harold Sims dies, practically on Mrs. Blake's doorstep. And when I called on Mrs. Blake this morning, she was clearly frightened and untruthful about several matters." Mrs. Clement looked shocked. "You surely don't think Mrs. Blake had anything to do with Harold's death?" "I think Harold may have been carrying something that someone desperately wanted, or desperately didn't want delivered. Whether Mrs. Blake was that someone remains to be determined." The vicar rose and paced to the window, his hands clasped behind his back. "This is very serious, Miss Marple. If you're right, we're talking about murder, not an accident." "I know. That's why I wanted to speak with you first, before taking my concerns to the police. What can you tell me about Mrs. Blake's dismissal from the Faversham household?" Clement turned back to face her. "It happened about 5 months before Miss Faversham's death. The colonel accused Mrs. Blake of attempting to influence his sister to change her will in Mrs. Blake's favor. He claimed he discovered her going through private papers and conducting whispered conversations with the family solicitor without his knowledge or consent. Was there any truth to the accusation? I can't say with certainty. Mrs. Blake maintained she was merely acting on Miss Faversham's instructions, that the old lady wished to make provisions for her care after years of faithful service. But Colonel Faversham was adamant. He dismissed her without a character reference and threatened legal action if she ever contacted his sister again. Miss Marple absorbed this information quietly. And Miss Faversham's will as it stands? Mrs. Clement answered this time, her voice low. Everything went to the Colonel. Miss Faversham was quite wealthy, you know. The estate was valued at over $20,000. There were rumors that she had intended to leave something to Mrs. Blake, perhaps even a substantial bequest. But if such a will existed, it was never found. How very convenient for the Colonel. Miss Marple, the vicar said warningly. I'm not making accusations, Leonard. Merely noting facts. Tell me, did Mrs. Blake contest the will? Not that I'm aware of. She took the cottage here and has lived quietly ever since, until now. I would have said she was a perfectly respectable widow who'd suffered an injustice, but accepted it with grace. Miss Marple sat down her teacup with decision. I think it's time I had a conversation with Constable Palk. There are several things he should know. She rose to leave, but the vicar stopped her. Miss Marple, before you go, I should mention something else. It may be nothing, but it's been weighing on my mind. The postmistress, Mrs. Pritchard, mentioned to me yesterday that Mrs. Blake had been asking questions about the mail delivery to Faversham Hall. When was this? 2 days before Christmas. Mrs. Blake came into the post office and asked quite casually what time the Colonel's post was usually delivered, and whether there was anything expected from London. Mrs. Pritchard thought it odd at the time, but didn't think much of it until after Harold's death. Did she tell this to Constable Palk? I believe she may have mentioned it this morning. I encouraged her to do so. At any rate, Miss Marple nodded slowly, her mind working rapidly through the implications. That's very illuminating. It suggests premeditation, doesn't it? If Mrs. Blake knew a letter was expected from the solicitors and knew when it would likely arrive, she might have made plans to intercept it. But how? Mrs. Clement asked. She could hardly waylay the postman in broad daylight. No, but she might offer him money to delay the delivery, or to allow her to see the letter first. Harold Sims was an honest man, but he had 3 children and a modest income. The temptation to earn a bit extra at Christmas might have been considerable. The vicar looked pained. You're suggesting Harold was complicit in some scheme. I'm suggesting he may have been approached with what seemed like a harmless request. Perhaps Mrs. Blake asked him to let her see the letter before delivering it to the Colonel. She might have claimed she had information relevant to the case, or that she wanted to prepare a response. Harold would have had no reason to suspect any real harm in it. And then something went wrong, Mrs. Clement said quietly. Yes. Perhaps Harold read the letter himself and realized its true significance. Or perhaps Mrs. Blake's intentions were never as innocent as she claimed. Either way, Harold ended up dead, and the letter disappeared. Miss Marple gathered her gloves and handbag. I must speak with Constable Palk immediately, and I think he should search Mrs. Blake's cottage while there's still time. If that letter exists, it may be hidden there, and it could provide proof of what really happened on Christmas Eve. As she walked home through the snowy lanes, Miss Marple reflected on the nature of greed and guilt. She had seen it so many times in St. Mary Mead in cases both large and small. People who convinced themselves that they deserved something, that they had been wronged, that one small transgression was justified by past injuries. Mrs. Blake had lost a position and possibly an inheritance she felt was rightfully hers. And at Christmas, When the darkness came early and the snow covered everything in white, she had decided to take back what she thought she was owed. But greed and guilt always walked together. Miss Marple knew, and they always left footprints, no matter how carefully one tried to cover them. Chapter 6. Tea at the Vicarage. The following afternoon found Miss Marple once again at the vicarage, this time in the company of Mrs. Bantry from Gossington Hall. Mrs. Bantry had descended upon the village with her usual energy, demanding to know everything about the dreadful business with Harold Sims. "I've been in London for Christmas with my sister," she announced, settling herself comfortably with a plate of seed cake, "and I returned to find the village in absolute turmoil. A postman dead, letters missing, and the police searching cottages. What on earth has been happening?" Mrs. Clement poured tea while Miss Marple provided a careful summary of events. She left out her own suspicions, but included the pertinent facts about the missing letter and Mrs. Blake's connection to the Faversham estate. Mrs. Bantry's eyes widened. "Mrs. Blake, that quiet woman at Weatherby Cottage. Surely you're not suggesting she had anything to do with it?" "I'm merely observing that there are questions that want answering," Miss Marple said mildly. "Well, I can tell you something about Mrs. Blake that may interest you." Mrs. Bantry leaned forward conspiratorially. "I saw her at the post office 2 days before Christmas. I'd gone in to post some last parcels, and there she was asking the most peculiar questions." Miss Marple set down her teacup. "What sort of questions?" "Oh, about when the mail would be delivered to Faversham Hall, and whether Mrs. Pritchard knew if anything important was expected from London. I thought it odd at the time, but you know how one doesn't like to appear nosy. Mrs. Pritchard told her she couldn't discuss other people's post quite properly, but Mrs. Blake was most persistent." "Did she say why?" "She wanted to know something about needing to contact the colonel on an urgent matter, though she wouldn't say what. Mrs. Pritchard suggested she simply telephone the hall, but Mrs. Blake said the colonel wouldn't take her calls. There was obviously bad blood there." The vicar entered then, bringing with him Constable Polk, who looked distinctly uncomfortable. "Miss Marple, Mrs. Bantry, good afternoon. Constable Polk has just been bringing me up to date on the investigation." Polk cleared his throat. "Following your information, Miss Marple, we obtained permission to search Weatherby Cottage this morning." Miss Marple's knitting needles paused. "We found nothing." "No letters, no documents relating to the Faversham estate. Mrs. Blake was most cooperative, I must say. Showed us through every room, opened every drawer." Miss Marple resumed her knitting, though her expression remained thoughtful. "I see. That is disappointing, though not entirely unexpected." "There's something else," Polk continued, pulling out his notebook. "We've been making inquiries about Harold Sims's movements on Christmas Eve. The postmistress has come forward with information. She says Harold confided in her, quite upset he was, about a week before his death." "What did he tell her?" "He said someone had offered him money to misplace a letter, not lose it permanently, mind you, just delay it for a day or two. He was quite shocked by the suggestion and told Mrs. Pritchard he'd refused outright." "Did he say who made this offer?" the vicar asked. "He wouldn't give a name, but he said it was someone from the village. Someone respectable who ought to have known better. Those were his exact words." Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily. "And Mrs. Pritchard didn't think to mention this earlier?" Polk looked sheepish. "She says she didn't want to speak ill of the dead, or cause trouble without proof. But after we searched the cottage, she felt it was her duty to come forward." "How very convenient," Miss Marple murmured. "Though I suspect Harold's refusal is precisely what led to his death. If someone was desperate enough to steal that letter, they wouldn't have given up simply because Harold said no." Mrs. Bantry set down her teacup with a clatter. But if Mrs. Blake approached Harold with money and he refused, what could she do? She could hardly force him. She could wait, Miss Marple said quietly. Wait until he was on his final round in the dark and the snow near her cottage. Then she could try again, perhaps with threats this time instead of money. Or she could simply take what she wanted by force. The room fell silent. Even Mrs. Bantry seemed subdued by the implication. Constable Polk shifted his weight. We've no proof of any of this, Miss Marple. Mrs. Pritchard can't swear it was Mrs. Blake who approached Harold. And without that letter, we've no evidence that anything criminal occurred at all. Dr. Haydock maintains the death was accidental. What does the colonel say? Miss Marple asked. Surely the contents of his missing letter would shed light on the matter. He says the letter concerned the final distribution of his sister's estate. Apparently, there was some question about a codicil to the will dated just before Miss Faversham's death. The solicitors were writing to inform him of their findings. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. A codicil? How interesting. And what did this codicil contain? The colonel wouldn't say. Claims it's private family business. Which suggests it contains something he doesn't wish made public. Miss Marple set aside her knitting with decision. Constable, I think you should press the colonel for more information. If that codicil named Mrs. Blake as a beneficiary, it would provide a clear motive for her actions. But we still don't have the letter itself, Polk protested. Without it, how can we prove anything? Miss Marple smiled faintly. Letters are stubborn things, Constable. They have a way of turning up in the most unexpected places, and people who steal letters often make the mistake of keeping them, thinking they're safe. Mrs. Blake may have hidden it too well during your search, or she may have it somewhere else entirely. Where would you suggest we look? I would suggest you consider where a woman might hide something she needs to keep close, but doesn't dare keep in her home. Somewhere she visits regularly, where she could check on it, but where no one would think to search. The vicar caught his breath. The church, Miss Marple nodded slowly. Mrs. Blake attends service every Sunday without fail, and she has access to the building through her work with the Altar Guild. It would be a simple matter to conceal something among the hymn books or beneath the altar cloth. Who would think to look there? Polk stood abruptly. I'll search it this evening, with your permission, Vicar. After he left, Mrs. Bantry looked at Miss Marple with newfound respect. You really do have the most remarkable mind, Jane. How do you think of these things? Miss Marple smiled gently. Human nature, my dear Dolly. Greed and guilt always walk together, and they always leave footprints. One simply has to know where to look. Chapter 7. The Parcel Without a Name. The search of the church yielded nothing, to Constable Polk's evident frustration and Miss Marple's quiet disappointment. She had been so certain of her reasoning, but the Altar Guild's cupboards, the vestry, and even the space beneath the pews revealed no hidden correspondence. Perhaps she destroyed it, Polk suggested when he called on Miss Marple the next morning. Burned it in that fire of hers. Perhaps, Miss Marple agreed, though her tone suggested doubt. Though that seems wasteful, if the letter contained information useful to her claim on the estate. One would think she'd want to keep it as leverage, unless the letter said something she didn't want anyone to see. That's possible, too. Tell me, Constable, has Harold's bicycle been thoroughly examined? Just the usual look-over, miss. Why? I wonder if you might examine it again, more carefully this time. Harold was a methodical man, and postmen often have little hiding places in their equipment. A pouch under the seat, perhaps, or a basket with a false bottom. Polk looked thoughtful. Worth a try, I suppose. The bicycle's still at the station. I'll have another look this afternoon. It was late that same day when he returned, his face flushed with cold and excitement. Miss Marple, you were right. Hidden beneath Harold's scarf in the bicycle basket, there was a small parcel wrapped in brown paper. no bigger than attic of cards. No label, no name, nothing to say who it was for or where it came from. Miss Marple set aside her knitting with interest. May I see it? Pock produced the package carefully. The brown paper was water-stained but intact, tied with simple string. Miss Marple examined it without touching, her keen eyes noting every detail. Has it been opened? Not by us. We wanted your advice first, seeing as how you've been so helpful. How very considerate. I think you'd better open it, Constable, but carefully, if you please. Pock cut the string and folded back the paper with deliberate care. Inside, nestled in tissue, lay a silver locket on a delicate chain. He held it up to the light, and Miss Marple leaned forward to examine the engraving on its surface. To E.B., she read aloud. How very interesting. E.B., Polk repeated. Edith Blake. It would seem likely, though I wonder how Harold came by it, and why he was carrying it in his basket, rather than delivering it properly. Miss Marple reached for her handbag and withdrew a small magnifying glass, one of several useful items she kept about her person. She studied the locket closely, then asked Polk to open it. Inside were 2 miniature photographs, faded with age. One showed a young woman with dark hair and serious eyes. The other was of an older woman, handsome and aristocratic in bearing. The younger one could be Mrs. Blake, 20 years ago perhaps. And the other is Miss Faversham, Miss Marple said with certainty. I remember seeing her about the village before her health declined. This locket must have been a gift from Miss Faversham to Mrs. Blake, a token of affection and gratitude. Perhaps. But what was it doing in Harold's bicycle basket? Miss Marple sat back, her fingers steepled beneath her chin. I can't think of 2 possibilities. Either Harold was returning it to Mrs. Blake on Miss Faversham's behalf, after it had somehow come into his possession, or he was taking it away from her, perhaps as evidence of something. Evidence of what? That's what we need to determine. Tell me, if Mrs. Blake possessed such a locket, given to her by her former employer, what might that prove? Polk scratched his head. That they were close. That Miss Faversham thought well of her? Precisely. It would support Mrs. Blake's claim that she was more than just a servant, that she had been genuinely cared for, perhaps even loved as a companion. Such a gift might even suggest that Miss Faversham had intended to remember her in the will. So Harold was taking it to prove Mrs. Blake's claim or to demand something in exchange for it. Miss Marple's voice was gentle but firm. Harold was an honest man, as we've established, but he was also a man with a family and modest means. If he discovered that Mrs. Blake had been trying to intercept the Colonel's letter, he might have confronted her. And if he had this locket in his possession, he might have used it as leverage. You mean blackmail? I mean a kind soul trying to do the right thing in the wrong way. Harold might have told Mrs. Blake he would return the locket only if she confessed to her scheme, or he might have threatened to show it to the Colonel as proof of Miss Faversham's true feelings toward her. Either way, it would have placed Mrs. Blake in a very dangerous position. Polk wrapped the locket carefully back in its paper. This changes things. If Harold was carrying this on Christmas Eve, and if Mrs. Blake knew about it, that gives her an even stronger motive for wanting him silenced. Indeed. The question is, how did Harold come by it? Did Mrs. Blake lose it, and he found it? Or did he take it from her cottage? We should ask Mrs. Blake directly. Miss Marple shook her head slowly. I think not, just yet. She'll only deny ever seeing it. No, I believe we need to understand more about the relationship between Mrs. Blake and Miss Faversham first. And for that, I think we should speak with someone who knew them both well. Who would that be? The Colonel's housekeeper, Mrs. Dorr, she was with the family for many years, and would have witnessed the dynamics between Miss Faversham and her companion. If anyone can tell us why this locket mattered so much, it would be her. After Polk departed, Miss Marple sat alone by the fire, turning the pieces of the puzzle over in her mind. The locket was a significant find, but it raised as many questions as it answered. She thought of something her friend, Sir Henry Clithering, had once told her. He'd said that in his experience as a former commissioner of Scotland Yard, the smallest objects often proved the most damning. A button, a ticket stub, a scrap of fabric, things people overlooked because they seemed insignificant. This locket was not insignificant. It represented affection, loyalty, and perhaps even love, but it also represented betrayal, greed, and ultimately murder. Miss Marple had remarked to Constable Polk that kindness sometimes placed one in dangerous company. Harold Sims had been a kind man, trying perhaps to help Mrs. Blake in some misguided way, or perhaps trying to force her to be honest about her intentions. Either way, his kindness had led him to Old Mill Bridge on a snowy Christmas Eve, where someone had decided that silence was worth more than a human life. The fire crackled softly in the grate, and outside the window fresh snow began to fall. Miss Marple picked up her knitting, but her thoughts remained on that small silver locket and the two faces trapped inside it, frozen in time like Harold Sims beneath the bridge. Chapter 8. Footprints to the Bridge, Mrs. Dorr. Proved to be a forthright woman in her 60s, with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense manner. She received Miss Marple in the housekeeper's sitting room at Faversham Hall, a comfortable space with chintz curtains and a tidy fire. "The Colonel's in London for the day," she said, pouring tea. "Business with his solicitors, though what more there? Is to discuss about Miss Faversham's affairs, I couldn't say. It's been 6 months now since she passed. I understand it's been a complicated estate," Miss Marple ventured. Mrs. Dorr snorted. "Complicated because the Colonel made it so. Miss Faversham had everything arranged perfectly clear, or would have done if he'd let her be. You're speaking of Mrs. Blake." "I am. And before you ask, yes, I'll tell you what I know. That poor postman's death wasn't no accident, and if speaking plain will help get to the truth of it, then speak plain I shall." Miss Marple settled more comfortably in her chair. "I would be most grateful for any information you can provide. Mrs. Dorr," set down her cup with decision. "Mrs. Blake came to us 5 years ago when Miss Faversham's health began failing. She was a good companion, attentive and kind. More than that, she genuinely cared for Miss Faversham. I could see it in the little things, the way she'd read to her for hours, never showing impatience, how she'd remember just how Miss Faversham liked her tea, or which shawl she preferred on cold days. Miss Faversham grew fond of her. Very fond, more than fond, I'd say. She came to depend on Mrs. Blake completely, called her my dear Edith, and would ask for her first thing every morning. The Colonel didn't like it one bit. Why not? Jealousy, pure and simple. He never paid much attention to his sister when she was well, but once she was ailing and needing care, suddenly he was all concern, visiting every week, bringing flowers, asking about her comfort. But it was Mrs. Blake she wanted, not him." Miss Marple nodded slowly, a picture forming in her mind. "And the locket?" Mrs. Dorr looked surprised. "You know about that?" "I've seen it. A silver locket with both their photographs inside. Miss Faversham gave it to Mrs. Blake 2 months before she died. I was there when she did it. She called me in as a witness. Said she wanted someone to know that Edith Blake had been more than a servant to her, that she'd been a true friend and companion, and deserved to be remembered." "Did she mention her will at that time?" "She did. Said she'd made provisions for Mrs. Blake, though she wouldn't say what. But the Colonel must have got wind of it somehow. 2 weeks later, he dismissed Mrs. Blake without warning. Said he'd found her going through private papers and trying to influence Miss Faversham against him." "Was that true?" Mrs. Dorr hesitated. Mrs. Blake had been helping Miss Faversham organize her correspondence. The old lady's hands shook too much to write clearly, so Mrs. Blake would pen letters for her. Whether that included letters to the solicitors, I couldn't say, but I never saw her do anything underhand. What happened to the will? That's the peculiar thing. After Mrs. Blake was dismissed, Miss Faversham asked to see her will several times. She seemed agitated about it, kept saying something wasn't right. But the colonel told her the solicitors had the only copy, and it was perfectly safe. She died a month later, quite suddenly, though Dr. Haydick said it wasn't unexpected given her condition, and when the will was read, everything, to the colonel, not a mention of Mrs. Blake nor anyone else except a few small bequests to the staff. I got 50 and a brooch that had been Miss Faversham's mother's. But for Mrs. Blake, who'd given 5 years of devoted care, there was nothing. Miss Marple absorbed this quietly. Did you think that was strange? I thought it wrong, and I said as much to the solicitors when they came to read the will, but they showed me the document properly signed and witnessed, dated 3 years ago, before Mrs. Blake ever came to the household. So, if Miss Faversham had made a new will or a codicil to the old one, it was never found. That's right. And Mrs. Blake left the village in disgrace, with not even a character to show for her years of service. Miss Marple thanked Mrs. Dorr and took her leave, her mind working rapidly. The picture was becoming clearer, though several pieces still didn't fit quite right. She decided to visit Old Mill Bridge herself. Despite the cold and the treacherous paths sometimes she had found being present at the scene of a tragedy revealed things that no amount of testimony could provide. The bridge was a simple stone structure, old and narrow, with a low wall on either side. The stream below ran fast and dark, swollen with melted snow. Miss Marple stood where Harold's bicycle had been found and looked around carefully. The lane from the village approached the bridge from the west, passing within 50 yards of Weatherby Cottage. On the eastern side, the lane continued toward Faversham Hall and the farms beyond. In the snow near the bridge railing, Miss Marple could still make out the disturbed area where the search party had worked. But there was something else. 2 sets of footprints, partially filled but still visible, leading from the direction of Mrs. Blake's cottage to the bridge. One set was larger, deeper, a man's boots, she judged. Harold's, almost certainly. The other set was smaller, lighter, a woman's boot, stopping near the railing where the snow was most disturbed. Miss Marple examined the railing itself. At one point the stone was chipped, a fresh mark showing white against the weathered gray. She ran her gloved fingers over it thoughtfully. She walked to the cottage side of the bridge and looked back. From here, one could see the sitting-room window of Weatherby Cottage quite clearly. Mrs. Blake would have had a perfect view of anyone approaching the bridge. Miss Marple closed her eyes and tried to imagine the scene. Harold, carrying his satchel and the hidden locket, approaches the bridge on Christmas Eve. The snow is falling heavily. He sees a figure emerge from the cottage, hurrying toward him through the darkness. They meet on the bridge. Words are exchanged. Perhaps Harold shows her the locket, tells her he knows about her plan to intercept the colonel's letter. Perhaps he threatens to expose her, or perhaps he merely offers to return the locket if she'll abandon her scheme. But Mrs. Blake is desperate. 5 years of service, a promise of remembrance, all taken away by a jealous brother, and now a letter arriving that might change everything, might prove that Miss Faversham had indeed made provisions for her. An argument, a struggle. Harold slips or is pushed. His head strikes the stone railing, and he falls into the dark water below. Miss Marple opened her eyes and looked down at the stream. It was a long fall onto rocks and into freezing water. Harold would have had no chance. She made her way carefully back along the lane, her walking stick tapping a steady rhythm. As she passed Weatherby Cottage, she noticed movement at the window. A curtain twitched, then fell back into place. Mrs. Blake was watching, and she would know now that someone else had been examining the bridge, someone who might have seen what she had hoped would remain hidden forever. That evening, as Miss Marple sat by her fire with her knitting, Lucy brought disturbing news. Mrs. Blake was seen at the churchyard this afternoon, Miss walking about in the snow looking at the graves. Mrs. Bantry's gardener saw her and said she seemed quite distraught. Asked if she was all right, and she said she was visiting her husband's grave, though everyone knows Mr. Blake is buried in Somerset where he died. Miss Marple's needles paused. At the churchyard? What time was this? Just at dusk, miss, and she was carrying something white in her hand. The gardener couldn't see what it was. Miss Marple set down her knitting and rose quickly. Lucy, fetch my coat and boots. I need to go out. At this hour, miss? It's nearly dark. Precisely. I believe Mrs. Blake may be about to do something very foolish indeed. Chapter 9. The Letter That Shouldn't Exist. The churchyard was quiet and shadowed when Miss Marple arrived, her breath misting in the cold evening air. The snow had stopped falling, and a pale moon illuminated the gravestones with silver light. She made her way carefully along the path, past the ancient yew tree and the oldest graves, toward the newer section where burials from the past decade lay. Her eyes scanned the ground, looking for any sign of disturbance in the snow. Near the far wall, where the churchyard met the lane, she found what she was seeking. Fresh footprints led to the gate, and there, scattered in the snow near the stone wall, lay torn fragments of paper. Miss Marple knelt down with some difficulty and began gathering the pieces. White paper, expensive quality, with elegant letterhead visible on several fragments. Even in the dim light, she could make out the words, Brent and Weatherby, solicitors, at the top of one piece. Working quickly despite her cold fingers, she collected every scrap she could find and placed them carefully in her handkerchief. Then, hearing voices from the direction of the church, she made her way back toward the lych gate. The vicar was locking the church door, Constable Polk beside him. Miss Marple, Clement said with surprise, "Whatever are you doing here at this hour?" "I might ask you the same question, Vicar, though I suspect we're all here for the same reason." Polk stepped forward. "We had word that Mrs. Blake was seen acting strangely near the churchyard. I thought it best to investigate." Miss Marple drew out her handkerchief and opened it carefully. "Then perhaps you should see what I found, torn pieces of a letter, scattered near the back wall, from Brent and Weatherby, if I'm not mistaken." The three of them returned to the vicarage, where Mrs. Clement provided a large table and good light. With infinite patience, Miss Marple began arranging the fragments, fitting them together like a jigsaw puzzle. It took nearly an hour, and several pieces were missing, but eventually the letter began to take shape. Polk copied down the visible text in his notebook as they worked. To Mrs. Edith Blake, Miss Marple read aloud from the reconstructed salutation. "Dear Madam, as per your request of the 15th instant, we have completed our examination of the documents in question. The middle section was badly damaged, but fragments remained. The codicil dated 3rd of June clearly states division of the estate. Miss Faversham's express wishes, half of the residual estate to be held in trust." Polk looked up sharply. "Half the estate to Mrs. Blake?" Miss Marple continued piecing together fragments. "Not quite. Look here at this portion. It says, 'Held in trust for the benefit of Mrs. Edith Blake, in recognition of faithful service and true companionship.' And here, further down, said codicil, 'Duly witnessed and properly executed.'" The vicar leaned over her shoulder. So there was a codicil. Miss Faversham did intend to provide for Mrs. Blake after all. It would appear so. But look at the date on the letter itself, December 23rd. This was the letter Harold was carrying to Colonel Faversham, the letter that never arrived. Polk frowned at the fragments. But I don't understand. If this letter was meant for the Colonel, why does it address Mrs. Blake? And why would she tear it up and scatter it in the churchyard? Miss Marple sat back, her face grave. Because it isn't the real letter, Constable, or rather, it's a forgery. A very clever one, but a forgery nonetheless. How can you tell? Several things. First, the paper quality doesn't quite match what a firm like Brent and Weatherby would use. It's good paper, but slightly different in weight and texture. Second, look at the way the firm's name is printed at the top. That font is nearly correct, but the spacing is fractionally off. She pointed to another fragment. And most damning of all, look at this phrase here. As per your request of the 15th instant, no proper solicitor's clerk would use both as per and instant in the same sentence. It's redundant and awkward. Someone tried to sound legal and formal but didn't quite manage it. Polk's face darkened. So Mrs. Blake forged a letter from the solicitors. I believe so. She must have obtained a sample of their letterhead somehow, perhaps during her time at Faversham Hall, when she was helping Miss Faversham with correspondence. Then she created this false letter, claiming that the codicil had been found, and the estate would be divided. The vicar looked puzzled. But to what purpose? Surely the Colonel would have seen through it immediately. Not if he never received it. I think Mrs. Blake's plan was more subtle than that. She intended to intercept the real letter from the solicitors, whatever it said, and replace it with this forgery. Then, when the Colonel read that a codicil existed, giving her half the estate, he would be forced to acknowledge her claim or risk a legal battle. But why would the real letter matter if she already had a forged one? Miss Marple selected another fragment and placed it carefully. Because I don't think the real letter said what she hoped it would say. Look at this piece here. It's on different paper entirely, older and more yellowed. I believe this is a fragment from the actual letter the solicitors sent. And see what it says here in this corner. No evidence of any such codicil. Searched thoroughly. Must conclude. The silence in the room was profound. The codicil never existed. Polk said slowly. The solicitors found nothing. Precisely. Mrs. Blake must have believed, or at least hoped, that Miss Faversham had created a codicil before she died. Perhaps Miss Faversham promised to do so, or Mrs. Blake witnessed her writing something, but the solicitor's letter would have confirmed that no such document existed, or could be found. That would have been the end of any claim Mrs. Blake might have made, so she decided to create her own evidence, the vicar said quietly. Yes, but she needed to intercept the real letter. First, to prevent the Colonel from learning the truth. That's why she approached Harold about delaying the delivery. When he refused, she must have decided to take more direct action. Miss Marple gathered the fragments together carefully. Harold discovered what she was planning. Perhaps he saw the forged letter, or perhaps Mrs. Blake admitted it to him when she was trying to convince him to help her. Either way, Harold realized the seriousness of what she intended. He confronted her on Christmas Eve, possibly threatening to expose her scheme, and she killed him to keep him silent. Polk finished. I believe so. But then she was left with both letters, the real and the forged. The forged letter was useless without the ability to substitute it for the real one, and keeping either letter was dangerous, so she destroyed them both, scattering the pieces in the churchyard, where she thought they would never be found. Polk stood, his face set. I'll go to Weatherby Cottage now and bring her in for questioning. I'll come with you, Miss Marple said quietly. I think she'll be expecting someone, and perhaps it would be better if a familiar face were present. As they walked through the snowy lanes toward the cottage, Miss Marple reflected on the sadness of it all. A woman who had given devoted service, expecting gratitude and remembrance, A promise made or imagined that was never fulfilled, and the terrible decision to take what she thought she deserved, no matter the cost. The lights were burning in Weatherby Cottage, and smoke rose from the chimney. But when they knocked, there was no answer. The door stood slightly ajar. They found Mrs. Blake sitting by the fire, staring into the flames. On the table beside her lay the silver locket, open to show the two faces within. She looked up as they entered, and Miss Marple saw in her eyes neither surprise nor fear, only a deep and weary resignation. Chapter 10. Christmas Morning. Truth. Mrs. Blake did not rise when they entered. She sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap, Harry's fixed on the dancing flames. "I knew you would come," she said quietly. "I saw you at the bridge this afternoon, Miss Marple, looking at the footprints, studying the railing. You're very observant." Miss Marple moved slowly into the room, while Constable Polk remained near the door, his hand resting uncertainly on his notebook. "Mrs. Blake, I think you should know that we found the remains of the letter, the one you tore up in the churchyard." Faint smile crossed the woman's face, bitter and sad. "Of course you did. I should have burned it properly, like I burned the real one, but I couldn't seem to think clearly anymore. After what happened with Harold, nothing seemed to matter very much." She reached for the locket on the table, running her fingers over the engraving. "She promised me, you know, Miss Faversham, the night before the Colonel dismissed me. She held my hand and said, 'You needn't worry, Edith. I've made certain you'll be provided for. You've been more than a servant to me. You've been a true companion, and I want you to be secure.'" Her voice broke slightly. I believed her. Why shouldn't I? She'd given Meth this locket only weeks before with both our pictures inside. She said it was a token of genuine affection, that I was the daughter she'd never had. Miss Marple settled herself in the chair opposite, her manner gentle but attentive. "But the Colonel dismissed you before Miss Faversham could finalize the codicil. He knew what she intended. That's why he sent me away. He told terrible lies about me, said I was trying to steal from her, that I'd been going through her private papers, but I was only helping her write letters, just as I always did." Her hands shook so terribly by then. Mrs. Blake's fingers tightened on the locket. "After she died and the will was read, there was nothing, not a word about me, not a penny. 5 years of devoted care, and I was forgotten, as if I'd never existed. The Colonel made certain of that." Polk cleared his throat. "So you decided to create evidence that Miss Faversham had made a codicil in your favor?" "Not at first. For months I told myself to accept it, to be grateful I'd had employment at all. But the injustice of it ate at me. I'd given up my own home to care for her, devoted every waking hour to her comfort. And the Colonel, who'd barely visited her twice a year when she was well, took everything." She looked up at Miss Marple, her eyes desperate for understanding. "I only wanted what should have been mine. What she had promised me, was that so wrong?" Miss Marple's voice was kind but firm. "Creating a false document was wrong, Mrs. Blake, but it was not the worst thing you did. Tell us what happened with Harold Sims." Mrs. Blake's face crumpled. "I never meant for that to happen. You must believe me. I only wanted to see the letter from the solicitors before the Colonel did. I thought, if there was news about a codicil, I could prepare my own claim, and if there was no codicil mentioned, I could substitute my forged letter and force the Colonel to acknowledge my rights. So you approached Harold and asked him to delay the delivery. I offered him money, 20, which was all I could spare, but he refused. He was very kind about it. Said he understood my grievance, but couldn't betray his duty. He was an honest man." Her voice dropped to barely a whisper. "On Christmas Eve, I waited for him by the bridge. It was snowing so heavily. and a thought perhaps in the darkness he might not recognize me at first. I could intercept the letter without him realizing until it was too late. But he did recognize you. Of course he did. Harold knew everyone in the village. He stopped his bicycle and asked what I was doing out in such weather. I told him I needed to speak with him urgently about the letter to Colonel Faversham. I begged him to let me see it, just for armament. Mrs. Blake's hands trembled as she set down the locket. He was sympathetic, but he said he couldn't do it. Then he told me he'd found this locket in the lane near my cottage, where it must have fallen from my pocket. He said he'd been meaning to return it, but when he saw the photographs inside, he realized who it belonged to and what it might mean. Miss Marple nodded slowly, the final pieces falling into place. He understood that it was evidence of Miss Faversham's affection for you. Yes, and Harold, kind Harold, thought he could help me. He said if I truly believed Miss Faversham had promised to provide for me, I should take the locket to the solicitors as proof of our relationship. He said doing things honestly was always better than doing them in secret. But you couldn't do that, because you had already created the forged letter. Mrs. Blake's face twisted with anguish. I panicked. If Harold encouraged me to go to the solicitors, and I did, they would eventually discover my forgery. Or if I refused his help, he might wonder why and investigate further. Either way, my plan would be ruined. So, you asked to see the letter one final time? I begged him. I said I only wanted to know what it contained, that I deserved that much at least. And Harold, because he was kind and because he pitied me, agreed. He took the letter from his satchel and handed it to me. She closed her eyes, tears sliding down her cheeks. I opened it there on the bridge, by the light. From a cottage window, and I read that the solicitors had found no evidence of any codicil that they'd searched thoroughly, and must conclude Miss Faversham's will stood as originally written, everything you'd hoped for was lost, everything, and Harold was standing there, watching. Me read it, seeing my face as I realized the truth. He started to say something comforting, about how I'd done my best and shouldn't feel bitter, but I couldn't bear it. His kindness, his pity, the knowledge that he would go back to his warm home and his children, while I had nothing. Her voice dropped to barely a whisper. I only meant to push him away, to make him leave me alone with my grief, but he stepped back and his foot slipped on the ice. His head struck the railing and he fell so quickly. I heard the splash as he hit the water, and then nothing. The room was silent except for the crackling fire. It climbed down to the stream, but it was too dark to see anything. I called his name, but there was no answer. The water was so cold, so fast. I knew he must be gone. And then you took his satchel and destroyed both letters. I couldn't think what else to do. If his satchel was found with the letters missing, people would wonder. But if the satchel disappeared entirely, it might simply be lost in the stream. I burned both letters in my fire that night, along with the envelope. The real one came in, but I'd already handled Harold's bicycle earlier when he first arrived, and my gloves had left marks in the snow. She looked up at Miss Marple with haunted eyes. I've barely slept since it happened. Every time I close my eyes, I see him falling. And I know that no matter what Miss Faversham might have promised me, I've lost any right to it now. I've lost everything, including my own soul. Constable Polk moved forward quietly. Mrs. Edith Blake, I'm placing you under arrest for the murder of Harold Sims. You'll need to come with me to the station. She rose without protest, reaching for her coat. I'm almost relieved. The waiting has been terrible. As they prepared to leave, Miss Marple spoke softly. Mrs. Blake, one question before you go. Did Miss Faversham truly promise you an inheritance? The woman's face softened with memory. She did. I'm certain of it, but whether she ever wrote it down or whether the colonel destroyed it after her death, I'll never know. Perhaps it doesn't matter now. After they left, Miss Marple sat alone in the cottage for a few moments, looking at the dying fire. The flames cast flickering shadows on the walls, and the room felt cold despite the warmth. She thought of Harold Sims, who had tried to help a woman he pitied, and for his kindness. She thought of Miss Faversham, who had perhaps made promises she couldn't keep or hadn't time to fulfill. And she thought of Edith Blake, consumed by a sense of injustice until it had destroyed her completely. Outside, church bells began to ring, their sound carrying clearly through the cold morning air. Christmas had come and gone, and with it, the innocence the village might have possessed. Miss Marple rose and made her way slowly home through the snow. Lucy met her at the door with hot tea and warm concern. As she sat by her own fire later, her knitting needles moving with their familiar rhythm, Miss Marple spoke quietly to herself. No postman should ever have to deliver guilt. It always finds its way home in the end. The needles clicked softly in the quiet room, and outside the window snow began to fall once more, covering the village in fresh white silence.